The same steel goes in dull and soft, comes out glass hard or spring tough or hard skinned. I have explained this to apprentices a dozen times now, and every time I watch their faces do the same thing, a slow crease of disbelief followed by something that wants to be awe. I understand the impulse. It looks like sorcery. It is just the most careful cooking in the world. The heat treatment shed stood apart from the main forge by 30 paces, which was Baek Tae-ho's requirement and not mine. He had his reasons. The air inside the main forge was already thick with variables, charcoal smoke, the breath of bellows, the scatter of scale, and Tae-ho wanted none of that contaminating what he called his readings. His shed was smaller, cleaner, and hotter in a different way, a focused, deliberate heat rather than the broad roar of the smelting furnace. When I stepped through the low doorway that morning, the warmth pressed against my face like a held palm. Tae-ho was at his bench with his back to me, turning a gear blank in his hands. It was a soft gray thing, freshly machined, still carrying the faint silver sheen of the cutting tool's last pass. Unremarkable. It could have been a river stone worn into shape by accident. He set it down without looking up. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said, "every time I hold one of these before it goes in?" I waited. "I keep thinking about how much work is already in it. The ore, the smelting, the forging, the machining, all of that, and it's still not done." He turned to face me. "One wrong step here and it's scrap." He was not wrong. Heat treatment is the last secret, and it is also the step most likely to be skipped by someone who doesn't understand what it does. A machine part looks finished. It has its shape, its dimensions, its fit. What it does not yet have is its character, the internal arrangement of its grain that determines whether it will hold under load or shatter, whether it will wear slowly over years or chew itself to dust in a season. That character is written in fire and time and the speed of cooling, and it cannot be seen from the outside until something breaks. Tae-ho lifted the blank and held it toward the furnace mouth, where the coals burned at the color he wanted, a particular orange-white that he had learned to read the way a river pilot reads the surface of moving water. He had been doing this for 2 years now, since the early days when I had handed him a cold chisel and a bucket of oil and explained the principle in terms so basic I was half embarrassed to say them aloud. He had not needed the embarrassment. He had needed the principle, and once he had it, he built the rest himself. The blank went into the furnace. We waited. Tae-ho watched the color. I watched Tae-ho. When he pulled it out, it was glowing, a deep, even cherry orange across its whole body, the color uniform enough that I felt a small, involuntary satisfaction at the sight of it. He held it for exactly the count he had established through weeks of testing, then plunged it into the oil bath. The oil erupted in a brief, violent hiss, smoke curling upward in a tight column, and when he lifted the part clear and wiped it down, it had changed, not in shape, in nature. "Hard now," he said, tapping it lightly with his knuckle. The sound was different, sharper, higher, with an edge to it that the soft blank had not possessed, and brittle enough to break if I look at it wrong. He set it on the bench and regarded it with an expression I had come to recognize as professional dissatisfaction. Half a transformation is no good to anyone. This is the trap that catches people who learn the first half of heat treatment and stop. Quench hardening takes a steel part from soft to glass hard in the time it takes oil to stop smoking. The hardness is real, so is the brittleness. The rapid quench that locks the carbon into its hard martensite structure also locks in stress, internal tension distributed through the grain like a held breath. Drop the part wrong, load it wrong, and it doesn't bend, it shatters. A gear that shatters in an engine is not a failed gear, it is a grenade. Tae-ho moved to the second furnace, smaller, cooler, its coals banked to a lower temperature, and placed the hardened blank inside. This was the tempering step, and it was here that his particular gift showed most clearly. Tempering requires heat, but far less than the initial hardening. The goal is to relieve the locked-in stress, to give the steel's structure enough energy to relax slightly without losing the hardness gained in the quench. The measure of that relaxation is written on the surface of the steel itself, in a sequence of colors that run across the polished face as the temperature climbs: straw, then bronze, then a spreading blue. He watched the colors the way I had once watched him watch them on a chisel. That had been the first week, the very first week, when I was still trying to understand what I had and what I was missing, when the whole enterprise felt like trying to build a ship from the description of a ship. I had needed to demonstrate something fast and legible, something that would make the principle visible, and the chisel was the right size for that. Tae-ho had watched the colors run across the steel's face and gone very still, and I had known then that he understood not just the fact, but the reason. He understood it better now. The same trick you taught me on a chisel the first week, he said, not looking away from the furnace. Only now I'm reading it on a gear that'll spin in an engine. He pulled the part at the right color, the bronze edge just beginning to shade toward blue at the thinnest sections, and set it to cool in still air. The brittleness was gone. The hardness had given back a fraction of itself in exchange for toughness, which is the trade you make and the trade you want. A tough, hard part bends before it breaks, and bending gives warning, shattering gives none. But a gear has a particular problem that neither quench hardening nor tempering alone can solve. A gear needs its teeth to be hard, hard enough to resist the constant grinding contact of mesh, the sliding and rolling pressure of load, and it needs its core to be tough, resilient enough to absorb shock without cracking through. These are opposing requirements, and no single composition of steel satisfies both simultaneously. The hard steel that resists wear is too brittle at its core. The tough steel that absorbs shock is too soft at its surface. There is no single steel that is both, so we make one steel be both, in the right places. Case hardening is older than I am, older than the kingdom, older than most of what passes for metallurgical knowledge in this part of the world. The principle is simple. Pack the steel part in a carbon-rich medium, charcoal, bone meal, the right organic material, seal it and hold it at temperature for long enough that carbon migrates into the surface layer of the steel, enriching it, changing its composition in the outermost skin, while the core remains unchanged. Then quench. The surface, now carbon-rich, hardens. The core, still low carbon, stays tough. One part, two natures, hard skin, soft heart. Tae-ho had a batch of gear blanks packed in their clay-sealed boxes, sitting in the case-hardening furnace. He had been running this step since before dawn. When he cracked the first box open and lifted the part clear of the spent charcoal, it was dark with carbon residue, unremarkable to look at. He cleaned it, quenched it, tempered it, and then held it up. He struck it with a small hammer, not hard, just a tap, the kind of tap you use to listen rather than to test. Tink. The sound was clean and high and definite. He nodded once. That's a part that'll live, he said. A dull thud is a part that'll fail. The metal tells you, if you've learned its language. Across the shed, Seo-rin was at her table, writing. She had been there since the first quench, recording temperatures against time, against the color observations Tae-ho called out to her, cross-referencing against the hardness tests she ran on witness coupons pulled from each batch, small rectangular bars of the same steel, processed alongside the actual parts, sacrificed to the file and the scratch gauge so the real parts didn't have to be. She had a system now, temperature range, soak time, quench medium, temper temperature, temper duration, final hardness, each variable recorded, each result logged, the recipe accumulating. A recipe 100 apprentices can follow, she said, without looking up from her writing, outlives the best ear in the world. Tae-ho made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. He respected Seo-rin's records. He also trusted his ear in a way that numbers on a page could not fully capture, and both of them knew it, and both of them were right. The ear was faster. The record was permanent. The right answer was to have both, which was what they had built. Cho Yeong had been standing near the doorway for the better part of an hour, watching. She was one of the orphan masters, one of the young people who had come up through the workshop, who had learned by doing before they had learned by being taught, whose hands knew processes that their mouths sometimes struggled to explain. She had a feel for proportion, for ratio, for the way things fit together by touch and eye. Heat treatment was not her domain, but she had asked to watch, and Tae-ho had let her stay. When he handed her the finished gear, the case hardened, tempered gear, cleaned and cooled, she turned it in her hands the way he had turned the blank that morning. Then she tapped it herself, mimicking the motion she had watched him perform. Tink. Her face opened. It rings now. She looked up, and her expression was the one I had seen on the apprentices, the disbelief cracking into something larger. Hard skin, soft heart, just like you said. How is this not magic? No one answered immediately. The furnace breathed. Tae-ho was already preparing the next batch. It was Seo-rin who spoke, setting down her brush. The temple claimed only a blessed bloodline could do it. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not bitterness exactly, more like the satisfaction of a long account finally settled. She had grown up near the temple, near the ceremonies, near the careful management of who was permitted to know what and why. It was here all along, in a furnace, for anyone. I thought about that. I had thought about it before, in other forms, watching other processes click into place. The three-plate method, the lead screw, the governor. Every time we made something repeatable, something teachable, something that did not require a particular bloodline or a particular blessing or a particular gift that could not be named or transferred, we were making the same argument, the argument that the wonder was never in the blood. It was in the method. They said wonder belongs to the few, I said. We keep proving it belongs to whoever shows up to learn. Cho was still holding the gear, still feeling its weight. She would carry that feeling with her, I thought. The ring of a part that would live. Heat treatment is invisible in the finished machine. You cannot see it. You cannot point to it. A gear that has been properly case hardened and tempered looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like a gear that has not. The difference lives inside the metal, in the arrangement of its grain, in the depth of its hardened case, in the residual stress pattern that determines how it will behave under load over time. It is the difference between a machine that runs a week and one that runs 30 years. This is why it gets skipped. This is why it was skipped here before I arrived. Not out of laziness, but out of ignorance, which is a different problem and a harder one. You cannot fix laziness with knowledge. You can fix ignorance with knowledge, but only if someone is willing to be the one who knows and the one who teaches, and only if the teaching produces records that outlast the teacher. Tae-ho was finishing the last batch of the day. He had been at it since before first light, and his face showed it, the particular exhaustion of sustained precision, which is different from the exhaustion of sustained labor. He moved more slowly now, but he moved with the same care. He would not rush the last batch to reach the end of the day. I had never seen him rush a batch. He pulled the final part from the tempering furnace, tapped it, listened. Tink. I'll not send a soul out with a part one haven't heard sing, he said. He set it on the cooling rack with the others. A row of gears, gray and unremarkable to look at, each one carrying its invisible character. The hard skin, the tough core, the tempered structure that would hold under load and resist wear and absorb shock without shattering. Parts that would go into the engine, parts that would, if the science held, run for years. If the science held. I looked at the row of finished gears and felt the thing I always feel at the end of a process. Not satisfaction exactly, something more like provisional confidence. The metallurgy was complete. The recipe was recorded. The parts had rung true under Tae-ho's hammer. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the only way you ever really know if your science held is when something fails, and then you'd better be able to find out why.